Thank you so much for joining us today, Councilmember Davis. We are thrilled to have you on the Policy Chats podcast.
It's my pleasure to be here, Rachel. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. You know, as the first LGBTQ council member in Redlands, you've been a trailblazer for inclusion, civic engagement, and community-driven solutions, whether founding the Redlands Youth Council, securing a $30 million Project Home Key grant for supportive housing, or leading the Persist Women's Political Engagement Conference at UC Riverside. Today, we're excited to dive into your work advancing equity, tackling homelessness, and building stronger, more connected communities. So with that, we're going to get right into our first question. Throughout your career as a council member for the City of Redlands these past 7 years, you've done a lot of great work.
Thank you.
Of course. And thank you. But what inspired you to run for office, and how did your prior experiences prepare you to work in local government? Because I know you've held a lot of different roles in the past as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. I should start by saying I grew up in Las Vegas, Nevada, and my mom worked for the Teamsters Union, and so I always joke that I grew up on the picket lines of the Las Vegas Strip, and I really think that early activism that I was involved in as a child shaped my sense of equity and justice and fairness, and my mom's been an amazing role model for all of those things. And so I grew up sort of on the periphery of politics. When I was young, I remember seeing both Bill and Hillary Clinton speak at different times at UNLV, and that had an impact on me in terms of just knowing that politics are important and they influence our everyday lives. And then fast forward to when I went to college at the University of Redlands, which is how I landed in the IE 20 plus years ago. I had a choice, you know, as all college students do, to think about, like, what do I want to major in? And at that time, when I was really struggling with that decision in my first year, a student said to me, "What are you passionate about?" And then that question, I think, has shaped so much of my life since then, when I really got to dig deep and think about the fact that I'm passionate about equity and inclusion. And so I designed my own major at the University of Redlands through a program called the Johnson Center for Integrative Studies. My major is called Social Psychology of Gender and Multiculturalism for Social Change. And I think for me, that foundation as a college student has been with me ever since. At that time, I decided intentionally not to go into politics. I thought politics is important, but it's toxic and it's stressful, and it's just not how I wanted to spend my life. I've spent my career in higher education, working mostly in student affairs at the University of Redlands and at UC Riverside. A couple years ago, I pivoted into government and community relations for UCR, and I really love doing that. But in terms of the turning point for me and why I got involved in politics, it was really the 2016 presidential election, when I thought that we would see our first female president in Hillary Clinton. I volunteered for her campaign in Redlands, and when that didn't happen, when she lost the election, I remember watching her concession speech the next morning. I had tears streaming down my face, and she was saying, "We need more women in politics." And that was the moment for me that was a catalyst, and I thought, well, maybe it's not such a wild idea to get involved in politics, and maybe it's time to get off the sidelines and see what I can do. And I think for me at that point, too, the national political scene seemed so far out of reach, and I thought the local level just seemed like a great place to start, because it's an impact that you can really see impacting your local community.
Yeah, that's such an amazing story and so inspiring. You know, I think if there's anything I've seen, you know, over the past few years doing the podcast, I've noticed some patterns with guests, and a lot of times the people that come on that ended up going into politics say that, you know, originally they didn't want to go into politics, but they realized that they wanted to make a change and they wanted to be part of that. So I think that makes some of the best politicians, the people who are, you know, are more focused on the solutions themselves and then get into politics to help accomplish those.
Absolutely. And I, like I said, I've spent my career in higher ed. I love working with college students, and I feel like that in itself is a form of making positive change and impact in the world. But a friend of mine described it as, you know, he said, "Denise, you're entering politics, and it just means you can paint with a bigger paintbrush in terms of the social change and the equity that you want to influence." And that's how I see it, really.
Yeah, that's amazing. And you mentioned how, the local level seemed more in reach for you. And I think local policy, I've learned more and more over the years is truly the place to make those innovative changes and inspire bigger policy changes at state and national level. Is this something that you've seen in your time there?
Absolutely, it is. When I was canvassing in 2018, and then when I was reelected again in 2022, I asked voters, residents, what's the biggest issue facing the city of Redlands? And by and large, people said homelessness. And I think this is pretty common throughout most cities in our nation, right? Especially in California. And so for me to understand what the voters are concerned about and then to be able to address it at the local level has been tremendously rewarding. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but I just wanted to say that's one example of seeing something tangible happen in your own community that really feels good about serving as a local elected official.
Wow, that's amazing. And you're right. We'll get to that just in a little bit. So kind of shifting back, I derailed us a little. As the first openly LGBTQ council member for Redlands and now currently the only woman serving in the council, what unique perspectives do you bring to local governance and how has your identity shaped your approach to policymaking?
Absolutely. I love this question. I think it's a really important question. And, when that pivotal moment happened for me about Hillary Clinton saying we need more women in office, and when I ran for office as the first openly LGBT council member, I could see exactly why, right? Because people are so reluctant to embrace change and reluctant to vote for someone who doesn't look historically like the people they've seen in any given governmental body. And I think it's important for those diverse voices to be at the table because we do bring different perspectives and different lived experiences into the policy conversation. For example, I have a lot of great friends in the region who were elected at the same time as me, women across the IE, and a lot of us have had babies while in office too. And so we have this shared experience of being younger in our 30s and 40s women, which is also unusual for this region, but also having this experience of becoming mothers while in elected office. And I think that for us, that's opened our eyes to where policy is lacking in supporting mothers, children, families. I'm taking my 2-year-old son constantly to parks and realizing where we have gaps in our parks in the city of Redlands, and I'm able to relay that feedback to my colleagues and try to push for change and try to push for more family-friendly policies and infrastructure in the city. And I can go on and on. That's one of many examples. But I think that being a woman and being a queer person gives me a perspective that's different than historically has been seen on the council. And I have tried my best to use my voice and my seat on the dais to raise awareness and to open doors for people who have historically been left out.
That's phenomenal, and that you're able to use your experiences that you share with a lot of your residents to help represent them well in your council.
Thank you.
Of course. And, throughout your career, you have advocated for various initiatives like these to promote inclusivity and visibility and reduce polarization, such as, recognizing Pride Month in the City of Redlands and, the Restorative Pathways Community Group, which was designed to build bridges between diverse groups of individuals. And as we mentioned earlier, you also have done great work on campus here with the Persist Women's Political Engagement Conference, helping, empower women to get started in politics and take action. So, and you've kind of touched on it a little bit, but what role does inclusivity play in your work and what impact can it have on both the local and the regional levels?
So when I was campaigning in 2018, it was a really eye-opening experience, right? Because people were a little bit apprehensive about, like I said before, voting for someone who is different to who they're used to voting for. But at the same time, I think that people really were excited about the fact that I'm bringing with me identities that maybe represent them or their families or people they know and people they care about, right? And I think that for me, policy change is really important in terms of being as inclusive and as welcoming as possible. But The real impact that I've noticed sitting up on the dais is when I propose things like the Pride Month proclamation, for example. I have been so moved by the people who show up and make public comments and have tears in their eyes talking about how much this means to them to be seen and valued by their city and how important that is. And in Redlands, we've done the Pride Month proclamation every single year that I've been on the council, and I did push for having the pride flag, and we did fly it twice. But then, unfortunately, my colleagues shifted, the council shifted, and some of the perspectives have shifted, and for the last couple of years, they've decided not to fly the pride flag, and I think that's sent a really damaging message to the LGBTQ community in Redlands, and I've seen the impact of that, and I'm going to do my best to keep pushing for other ways, to help our marginalized communities feel included. I do this through social media and events and every possible opportunity. But like I said, looking those people in the eyes at the city council meeting when they're getting emotional about how much it means to them to be seen and valued, that makes it all worthwhile.
It's so important that you get to see firsthand how these are impacting your residents and hear from them. You've mentioned that, while during your time on the dais, things have shifted a little bit and are starting to grow towards more inclusivity. I'm curious, in your second run for office, did you find that that process was a little bit more, or should I say less, I'm losing the word I'm looking for, but a little bit more inclusive and people were more open?
Yeah, I did find that, actually. The first time I ran for office, I encountered some clear discrimination and some moments of hostility, people slamming doors in my face. I think by the second time I was running, I had been in office for 4 years, people knew me a bit better, obviously, and I was running not just as some random person who wanted to do good for the city, but I was running as someone who had a track record of doing good things for 4 years. And I think that helped earn a lot of respect, even for people who are not from my political party. I've been able to have some difficult conversations with people from across the aisle. And one man in particular, I remember he was in his garage as I was walking up the driveway canvassing, and I thought, oh, I don't know how this is going to go. I see on my sheet his party affiliation, and he said to me, he said, I know who you are, and he said, we don't agree on everything, but I think you're doing a good job and I'm going to vote for you. So there's some surprising moments like that. And actually, you mentioned Restorative Pathways Community Group. I was happy to give them a proclamation, and they were carrying on some of the work that I was lucky to be a part of right before I got elected. That 2016 election had such an impact on me in terms of just seeing the divisiveness it caused in our community. And I was part of a group called the Common Ground Conversation Series, and it brought together Democrats and Republicans, and I served as the moderator of a couple of public events where the whole point was to find our points of agreement, right? We would have conversations around hot button issues, and instead of having a debate or a disagreement, the groups would only find what they agreed with, even if it was 5% of what the other side was saying, and then we would write it up on a whiteboard behind us and have a visual representation, something tangible to take away. And I think for me, that kind of work also was a motivating factor for why I wanted to get involved at the local level, because I wanted to be able to build those bridges and have our community not feel so tense.
That's so powerful. I think that's something that we've previously had a guest on the podcast who has dedicated his career to working on political polarization and reducing it. You can listen to the episode. It's with John Gable on filter bubbles and media bias. But he talked about how he had this one day where he met this woman who he ended up becoming friends with, and he realized that it was initially difficult for them, him a Republican and her a Democrat, to have a conversation. But once, they gave each other a moment and kind of let those walls down, they were able to have a very productive conversation. And in the end, they're not going to agree on everything. They're not going to change their beliefs completely necessarily, but I think it's so powerful that you were able to work with your community on that as a community member, and that your hard work in that was recognized by your constituents.
Yeah, I mean, that was a tremendous learning experience for me. I'm a Democrat, we worked with the Redlands Republican Women's Club, and their leader and I, even though we disagreed on a lot of policy-related items, we, found out that we both like cats, and we both, had a shared friend in common, and that was really helpful, right, to build bridges to a more productive and more warm conversation.
Yeah, that's amazing. So kind of shifting back, we talked a little bit earlier about homelessness and policy surrounding housing. To get back into that, you have helped Redlands secure a $30 million Project Homekey grant, which is a considerable milestone aimed at converting hotels into permanent supportive housing for the chronically homeless individuals in your community. Can you walk us through the process of securing this and how your city's earlier visit to Riverside's transitional housing model influenced your plan?
Absolutely. This is one of the things I'm most proud of in my time on the council. Like I mentioned before, homelessness has been identified as a major issue, as we talk to voters, but also in our community engagement surveys. And so for me, I thought strategically about how can we tackle this as a council. And this is another example of like every single seat of that 5-person dais really matters, because when I first got on the council, we had a mayor at the time who was adamant that we would not be addressing homelessness, and that he kept saying social services, that's not our line of work. And I obviously disagreed. I think that's our primary form of work at the local level. And once he left the council and was replaced by someone who had a different mindset and really wanted to proactively address homelessness in a really humane manner. Once she was on the council, Jenna Guzman-Lowry, I identified one other ally who I know wanted to move this conversation forward. And I invited that council member and the city manager to meet with me in Riverside, because my good friend Erin Edwards was on the Riverside City Council at the time, and they had just opened a terrific housing project, almost like tiny homes, right? Individual housing units for their unhoused population. And they were working with a nonprofit to do wraparound services. And I just thought that it was a really fantastic model. And it was something that I thought we could work on replicating in the city of Redlands. And so it was helpful to actually bring my colleagues to Riverside and say, look, someone in our region is doing this and doing it pretty well. I think that we should be, leaders in whatever capacity we can in San Bernardino County. And so knowing that the will of the council had shifted a bit and that we had that third vote that we needed to move this conversation forward, the city manager and his staff started exploring grants. And so they worked with the county. They opened up a conversation with the county, who opened up conversations with the state. And then we put together an application for a Homekey grant, and we were thrilled to win a $30 million Homekey grant from the state. And that has allowed us to build, as you mentioned, permanent supportive housing. It actually happens to be on the west side of town, which is in the district that I represent. And there are over 100 people housed there currently, and it's been remarkable to hear the stories of how this has really changed people's lives for the better. We also have hired our first ever homelessness services coordinator, and we've gotten more grants since then, and he's been hiring more staff. And we did our point in time count. We do a point in time count every year, and it was kind of amazing. The data speaks for itself. We were able to reduce homelessness in Redlands by 41%.
Wow.
And so that grant and that homelessness coordinator and the team that he's building and the relationships he's building with nonprofits who are already doing this work really on a shoestring budget, it's been a game changer for impacting homelessness in the city of Redlands. And so I would say that we are actually a leader in the region now doing this work, and certainly something that we're going to have to continue to work on. There's still more to do, but it's something that we're really proud of in terms of having achieved in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I think a lot of what we've heard on the podcast about how to create comprehensive solutions to big issues like homelessness, food insecurity, are really combining like local government efforts with nonprofits, community organizations that already have a foundation in their communities. I think we spoke recently with the CEO of Feeding America for Riverside, San Bernardino.
Yeah.
And she mentioned that there's a lot of like already work that they're doing. There's also a lot of great services that are provided by other organizations. And they had a great plan to allow other services and organizations to table at their food distribution center to connect people with resources that already exist.
That's amazing.
So may I ask, are there any specific organizations that you've been partnering with in Redlands or services that you've been providing in your supportive housing?
Yeah, there's a group called the Redlands Charitable Resources Coalition who's been doing this work for years, even before we got the grant, and there are several churches involved in that organization. And there's another nonprofit we worked with called Step Up, and so they've been great partners with us as well.
That's amazing. And I think it's interesting also that you mentioned that the funding came from the state level. I feel like usually when you hear about housing being provided, you think about your local PHA, and that money is usually coming from HUD. And the Department of Housing and Urban Development is designating all of the guidelines for those. What do you think makes it different that your grant came from the state level?
Yeah, I think that we have developed really good relationships with our state government, and I think sometimes DC can be great, but it feels really far away. I think that the state of California obviously has prioritized addressing homelessness, and we feel so grateful to have received this Home Key grant, and maybe part of the difference is too, when we had our launch of the housing project in Redlands, even the governor zoomed in, which was a really amazing gesture, and we appreciated having that relationship with him and his staff. It feels just a little bit easier to get in touch with them versus DC, perhaps.
That's so amazing that they're able to support, even if the governor can't come down to Redlands for the day, but to zoom in is amazing.
Yeah, we appreciated that.
So, going more into that, how does Redlands' approach to reducing homelessness, such as the Goodnight Inn conversion, differ from strategies that work better at the county and state levels? And what roles do collaborations between different levels of government, so local, regional, state, and so on, play in addressing homelessness?
Absolutely. I think that everyone is trying hard, from the state to the county to the cities. I think everyone is, in my experience, trying hard to use their resources to reduce homelessness in meaningful ways. I think one reason why we've been successful is that we are, a city of 70,000+ people, right? It feels a little bit easier to identify in our point in time count just how many, or at least a rough estimate of people are unhoused, and then it feels even a little bit easier to do some direct targeted outreach and really go out there and have teams of people offer services, right? And working with our trusted partners in the nonprofit and the religious, the church arena. People know these people, right? Like, they know the unhoused community, and they understand, who might be more willing to accept certain resources versus others. And I think sometimes when you're talking about addressing the problem from a state or even a county level, you lose that bit of personalized contact and knowledge of people and how best to serve them. And so I think that we need all forms of government working on this issue, but I feel especially gratified by the success we've had in Redlands working at the local level.
That's awesome that you're able to use those existing relationships that people have and knowledge that they have about your community to leverage that to help people get the support they need.
Absolutely.
And, being that you've been working in the homelessness and housing policy sphere for a little bit now, what are some of the biggest lessons you've learned or things that surprised you since starting off?
There's definitely been some bumps along the way, right? There's certainly people who need many more services than we can give them, or people who will refuse services, right? And that's been hard. And I think cities have tried to understand what to do if there's an encampment and they refuse services, right? I think that becomes a challenge, because you want to honor people's dignity and people's autonomy. But there's also this question sometimes of public health and safety. And so that's been difficult, wanting to really make sure that our policies address this issue, and like I said before, in a really humane way that honors people's dignity, while also, keeping the environment safe and healthy for other people around. So that's been a challenge, but I think we've navigated that in the best ways that we can. And certainly financially, when you're dealing with $30 million in grant funding, we've certainly had some hiccups and bumps along the way that we've had to work through, but I think the city staff has worked well with the county and the state and sort of navigating those challenges as they've arisen.
That's definitely very challenging, but I think hopefully over the years, as the program grows, it'll be able to find ways to reach those individuals.
Mm-hmm.
So one question that we ask all of our guests on the podcast is, to think about all the policies that you have in your head. I know a lot of people have a lot of great policy ideas, and think about if you were to create one policy tomorrow and make a change, whether at the local level in Redlands or if you have an idea for something more broad at the state or national level, what would be your one wish policy?
Oh, that's so tough. If we had endless amounts of money too, right? I can add that to the question.
Of course.
I started a climate policy council because I'm really concerned about climate change and issues impacting our environment. And I think that for me, working with the council, it's just volunteers, people from our local University of Redlands, some of the environmental scientists there, as well as community members involved in a nonprofit called ANCA, which is Accelerating Neighborhood Climate Action. And, I've spoken with them for the last several years. We've been meeting monthly, and we've been talking about, what policies could really impact the city as it relates to climate change. And people are very concerned with plastics, actually, with single-use plastics and the harm that it does to us as humans. There's a lot of data coming out now around microplastics. And so I think that for me, the policy would be, eliminating single-use plastics, but also finding ways to subsidize those businesses, right? I think that's sort of the hurdle that a lot of cities face, is how do we help businesses transition to more eco-friendly products, and not just eco-friendly, but human-friendly products, right? And so I would love to see more sustainable policies be implemented by and large by our city, from solar to community choice energy, right? Like, there's a long way we can go as it relates to being more sustainable, but especially as we live in the region with the worst air quality in the nation, I would love to see us reduce our carbon footprint and be able to tackle climate change goals at every level possible.
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to mention, the fact that in the context of this region in which we have a lot of warehousing and logistics, and there's a lot of air quality issues, where I think it's not uncommon to have day after day with our air quality levels so low that we're in the red, and it's just normal at this point.
Yeah, and I have been concerned about this for a long time, about air quality, and check my phone constantly about where the air quality is at on any given day, but especially when I had a child and I realized about the disproportionate asthma rates of children in this region. I've been especially concerned about our air quality, and feel like we need to do more urgently. And as a council member, for me, that means voting against warehouse projects. I think we have more than enough warehouses, and I know that can be an unpopular opinion for some, right? For some developers, for some labor unions, and I'm obviously a big fan of labor unions as I grew up in a union household, but this is another issue where I've really seen public opinion shift in Redlands over the last 7 years that I've been on the council. People were not nearly as concerned and engaged in 2018, but now every time a warehouse project comes up for a vote, we have droves of people come out and say, we do not want another warehouse in our city, because I think people are seeing the real tangible impact of this poor air quality, but also of the trucks on the roads, right? And the traffic, and just the impact to our overall quality of life. So until we can electrify these trucks and really all of our vehicles, I think it's going to be a challenge to envision more of this being a good thing.
Yeah, I think the dilemma with climate change is it's such a large, like, so complex issue to tackle. But I would say the opposite side of that, and something that one of our guests, Dr. Francesca Hopkins, who studies climate change here at UCR, discussed on the podcast, is that, you know, the great thing about climate change policies is they have a multitude of benefits. You know, if you're planting a tree, you're making your city more walkable, you're improving public health and mental health in your community, and you're also improving the air quality.
I love that.
And, you know, like, something as simple as that can have a tangible difference in so many different areas of people's lives. And so I think that's something that she mentioned gives her hope about, you know, this big, scary thing to tackle, such as climate change, that, you know, even a small step can go a long way.
Yeah, and I should say too, like, we have an amazing group in Redlands. I mentioned before, the Anka group. In the last few years, they have really done tremendous work to educate our community around the impacts of climate change and what we can do, you know, individually and collectively to be more sustainable and more resilient in the City of Redlands. And they just hosted an Earth Day celebration this past weekend. They had over 30 events, including a tree giveaway, in the city, and I just am encouraged by the great work and the education and the awareness that they're doing in Redlands.
Wow, that's so important that they're doing that work.
Yeah, it is.
And I think that is a great place to end. You know, whether it's housing policy, climate change, inclusivity, or, you know, helping bridge gaps and reduce polarization, there is truly so much that can be done at the local level, and being able to communicate with your residents and learn from their experiences so that you can represent them well and think about those policies that impact them the most is truly such a great way to make policy change.
Thank you, Rachel. That was an amazing summary, and thanks for having me on the show. It's been a real pleasure.
Of course, thank you. This podcast is a production of the UC Riverside School of Public Policy, and our theme music was produced by Veer Sinha. For the latest updates on the School of Public Policy, be sure to check us out at UCR_SPP on Instagram. Or, for more episodes and content, visit our YouTube channel. I'm Rachel Strassman. Till next time.